Pastor Matthew Stuckey here, and in this video I want to give you a book review of The Case for Faith by Lee Strobel. I've already reviewed his first book in regards to Christianity, The Case for Christ, and this is kind of complimentary. It's kind of an add-on. It's a completely different book, but it kind of talks about similar things that weren't mentioned in the first book. And The Case for Faith started off better than The Case for Christ, and I was thinking, yeah, it's pretty good. Then there's a lot of problems toward the end of it, so I think The Case for Christ was a better book, but there were some good parts of The Case for Faith. And so the book starts with an interview with Charles Templeton, and Charles Templeton became a very famous atheist. In his early days, he was actually a preacher with Billy Graham at Crusades, and he had a huge following, and then he ended up completely rejecting God and became an atheist. And I wrote books on that, and just, and supposedly in this interview, he wants to believe in Jesus, but, he just can't. And he talks about how he saw suffering in the world as a result of a photograph, and after that, it just shook his faith, and he never believed in everything. And so the purpose of the book is to look at the 8 biggest objections to Christianity, and Lee Strobel was interviewing experts on each topic to see what they say. So the first objection was, since evil and suffering exist, a loving God cannot. Interview with Peter Kreeft. And that is a big objection people have to Christianity or to the belief in God in general. How can there be suffering? I mean, if God is real, there cannot be any suffering. I thought that Peter Kreeft did a good job answering the questions. I don't think that the information was necessary to give to someone who's unsaved to try to win them to the Lord, but I thought he had good answers for explanations of why is there suffering, and how sometimes something might seem bad to us from a human perspective, but we don't see the end of the matter. So chapter 1 was a pretty good chapter. Chapter 2 was, since miracles contradict science, they cannot be true. William Lane Craig was the one who was interviewed, and this was definitely one of the top 2 chapters in this book. It was very good. I preferred this interview with William Lane Craig than the one in the previous book, The Case for Christ, and he had a lot of good explanations and logical arguments to explain. There was one problem with something that he said. He talks about becoming a Christian before he believed in the virgin birth. And I don't believe that you can get saved and just reject the core beliefs of Christianity. You might start going to church and believe in some of the things, but, that was one issue. But, aside from that, it was a pretty good chapter. I would recommend reading it if you get a chance. Chapter 3, Evolution Explains Life, So God Isn't Needed. Interviews with experts, Walter L. Bradley. Now, I really like this chapter. I don't know if everybody would, but I just love science and the evolution creation topic. I've studied it quite a bit. I've read a lot of books. I've preached a lot of sermons on those things. There's a lot of great arguments that just kind of smash evolution and the scientific arguments. So he has a lot of great arguments, and he goes through all those things. So that's a very good chapter, chapter 3. Then you have chapter 4, where it starts to go downhill, and chapter 4 is God isn't worthy of worship if he kills innocent children. That's the objection, and the discussion is with Norman L. Geisler. And Norman L. Geisler, he bashes the King James Bible several times to defend. We're basically like, well, yeah, in the King James it's true, but not in the NIV. He says, not so fast, Geisler cautioned. You're quoting from the King James Version, and it's open to misinterpretation there. And then he just says, if you go back to the original language, even though the King James was translated by 54 experts that spoke, a lot of languages, the biggest leading language experts in the world, people today that don't speak that many languages will claim that they could translate it better, and this is a mistranslation. I think it's ridiculous when it took them 6 years of 54 translators to diligently translate. But he says, well, it's an error in the King James. And then he says, later on, Geisler glanced briefly at the page, immediately recognizing its source. Unfortunately, the King James Version is a misleading version, and it renders the word boys. And he says, that's misleading. And then he says later on about there being a misreading if you go to the original Hebrew. And look, you shouldn't have to go back to a language you don't speak to defend the Bible. And people do that because they realize nobody really speaks Hebrew, and so they can go back to a language and people aren't going to understand the topic. But I believe the King James Bible stands on its own, and God is holy. And yes, God does sometimes wipe out groups of people and destroy groups of people. And from a human perspective, it might not always seem just to us, but God is right, and God is perfect, and God is holy. And I believe everything the Bible says, and I believe everything God did is correct. And so I'm not going to go to another language and just make up stuff. But that's what Norman Geisler does. Chapter 4 is not a very good chapter. Chapter 5, it's offensive to claim Jesus is the only way to God. I looked online because I didn't remember Rabbi Zacharias being the one who was interviewed. So I don't know if I saw something wrong there because I was just copying these notes down. Maybe I just missed the name. I didn't particularly think this was a great chapter. It was kind of boring. It was not really great arguments. I think they could have done much better just sticking to what the Bible says. I don't think that was Rabbi Zacharias. I think it was somebody else. But I read online it was Rabbi Zacharias was the one he interviewed. Regardless, it wasn't that great of a chapter. But anyways, chapter 6, a loving God would never torture people in hell. The interview is J.P. Moreland. This is by far the worst chapter from The Case for Christ or The Case for Faith. This is a horrible chapter. And J.P. Moreland spends a whole chapter just saying how hell is not a real place. It's just figurative language. Even though the Bible says we're tormented day and night forever and ever, the Bible says we're tormented in the presence of the angels and in the presence of the Lamb. He says hell is just separation from God, and it's just, symbolic of a burning desire for God and all these dumb arguments. It's like Luke 16 is in the Bible where he's asking for a drop of water. The Bible talks about Mark 9 where the worm dieth not, and it mentions many times the fire. It says tormented day and night forever and ever. It talks about going to the lake of fire. I mean, it's ridiculous to just say it's all figurative. Well, then you can just say everything in the Bible is figurative. So that was a very bad chapter. Chapter 7, Objection 7, church history is littered with oppression and violence. The viewpoint of John D. Woodbridge. The chapter was okay. There's some things I disagreed with. He had some good historical information. It's not the most exciting chapter. It wasn't a horrible one, but I wouldn't really look at it as a great chapter. Chapter 8, I still have doubts, so I can't be a Christian. Interview with Lynn Anderson. I didn't really agree with the premise of this chapter, and it was pretty dull. They seem to be saying like, hey, it's okay. You have doubts, you're not sure, but just become a Christian anyway. You got to understand and believe to become a Christian. And so you might go to church, but that doesn't make you a Christian. You have to actually believe on Christ. Then he ends with just a story about Charles Templeton, the one who was the preacher with Billy Graham. And this part was pretty bad as well. He says, an excited Templeton had exclaimed to her. So this is Templeton's wife recounting what had happened in his final moments before he died, because he has Alzheimer's in the book. It says, Madeline, do you see them? Do you hear them? The angels, they're calling my name. I'm going home. So apparently Charles Templeton, this atheist, said, hey, there's angels calling me. I'm going home. I'm going to heaven. An article in the Toronto Star elaborated. Suddenly, Madeline said he became very agitated, looking intensely toward the ceiling of the room, his eyes shining more blue than I'd ever seen before. He cried out, look at them, they're so beautiful. They're waiting for me. Oh, their eyes are so beautiful. Then with great joy in his voice, he said, I'm coming. So he says, I'm coming home, I'm going to heaven. The news nearly took my breath away. What was happening? Ivany thinks she knows. I really believed he finally made peace in his own very private way with God, and that he was going home to be with Jesus. In fact, she added Templeton would be one of the first people she would look for when she got to heaven. Me too, I thought as I read her words. Me too. So according to this, Lee Strobel also thinks Charles Templeton ended up going to heaven. Nothing about him hearing the gospel from someone and getting saved or changing his belief. He just said, hey, there's angels, I'm going home, and supposedly he went to heaven. Now, whether that actually happened with Charles Templeton, I have no idea. He had Alzheimer's, so he could have been hallucinating. Who knows? With the last stages of his life, oftentimes the mind goes. But he said, I'm coming home, they're coming to take me, the angels, and, Lee Strobel thinks that he went to heaven. I think that's pretty ridiculous. But this book, it had some good chapters toward the beginning, and I was really thinking halfway through, like, hey, actually, it's a solid book, and it just nosedived. I wouldn't recommend this book. Case for Christ was better. There were a few chapters in the Case for Faith with William Lane Craig and the chapter on evolution you could read that are interesting. Definitely not something I'd hand to an unbeliever, especially when you're saying hell's not a real place. You should just give them the gospel. There is some interesting information, but I wouldn't recommend this. It was a bit of a disappointing book, but there were some good parts in the book. Anyways, thank you and God bless.